In the winter of 1919, a small, unassuming man walked through the cold streets of Boston with nothing but a dream and a frayed coat. His name was Charles Ponzi. To the thousands of immigrants crowding the tenements of the North End, he did not look like a predator. He looked like one of them. He was a man who had spent years drifting through the underbelly of North America, sleeping on park benches and serving time in prisons from Montreal to Atlanta. But Ponzi possessed something far more dangerous than wealth. He possessed an idea so elegant, so statistically flawless, that it seemed to defy the very laws of economics. It was a mathematical miracle that promised to turn pennies into fortunes in a matter of days. The world was reeling from the aftermath of the Great War. Inflation was rampant, and the traditional banking systems offered nothing but meager interest and rigid barriers. People were desperate for a miracle. They were looking for a way out of the grind, a way to claim their piece of the American dream before it slipped through their fingers. And then Ponzi gave it to them. He told them about the International Reply coupon. It was a simple piece of paper, a postal voucher meant to be exchanged for stamps in different countries. But Ponzi had discovered a glitch in the global machine. Because of the fluctuating exchange rates in a post-war Europe, a coupon bought for a few cents in Rome could, in theory, be traded for much more in Boston. It was a classic case of arbitrage. Buy low, sell high, and exploit the friction of a broken world. He opened a small office on School Street, a cramped room that he called the Securities Exchange Company. He made a bold, impossible promise. If you gave him your money, he would return a 50% profit in 45 days. If you waited 90 days, he would double your investment. It was a rate of return that made the most successful financiers on Wall Street look like amateurs. At first, the skepticism was thick. People laughed. They whispered about the Italian immigrant who thought he was smarter than the banks. But then, the first 45 days passed. The first few investors walked into that small office, and they walked out with pockets bursting with cash. They had seen the miracle with their own eyes. The word spread like a contagion. It moved through the factories, the docks, and the church pews. The promise of easy money bypassed the brain and went straight to the heart of human greed. Ponzi was no longer a drifter. He was a savior. He was the man who had cracked the code of the financial universe. Within months, the line of people waiting to hand over their life savings stretched around the block. Men in silk hats stood side by side with widows clutching their meager pensions, all waiting to feed the machine. But as the millions began to pour in, a silent, terrifying reality was mounting behind the closed doors of the Securities Exchange Company. To make the International Reply coupon scheme work on the scale Ponzi was promising, he would have needed to move hundreds of millions of vouchers across the Atlantic. He would have needed a fleet of ships and a logistical empire that did not exist. In fact, there weren't even enough coupons in circulation in the entire world to account for the money he was taking in. The math was perfect on paper, but in reality, there were no stamps. There was no arbitrage. There was only a growing, hungry void. And as the piles of cash reached the ceiling, the clock began to tick on a debt that could never be repaid. By the spring of 1920, the office on School Street had become a shrine to the impossible. The air inside was thick with the smell of sweat and ink, and the sound of clerks frantically counting piles of greenbacks. Money was no longer being stored in vaults. It was being stuffed into wastebaskets, tucked into desk drawers, and piled in the corners of the room. Charles Ponzi was now bringing in $1 million a day. He had become a folk hero, a man who was sticking it to the cold, calculated elite of the banking world. He bought a mansion in Lexington with a heated swimming pool and a custom-built limousine. He draped his wife in diamonds and spoke to the press with the polished charisma of a statesman. He was the living embodiment of the American dream, a man who had turned a few cents into a financial empire. But beneath the polished mahogany desks and the expensive cigars, the mechanism was rotting. The secret that Ponzi kept locked away was that his business had no product. There were no shipments of coupons arriving from Italy. There were no massive warehouses filled with postal vouchers. Every dollar that he paid out to an old investor was simply a dollar taken from a new one. It was a closed loop, a predatory cycle that relied entirely on the momentum of belief. As long as the line of people outside his door grew faster than the line of people asking for their returns, the illusion held. But the physics of such a system are unforgiving. To sustain a 50% return every 45 days, the number of new investors required grows exponentially. It is a mathematical hunger that can never be satisfied. The established powers of Boston began to take notice. The old money, the bankers who had controlled the city's wealth for generations, looked at Ponzi with a mixture of envy and deep suspicion. They knew the markets. They knew that no legitimate enterprise could generate those kinds of returns without a massive, visible infrastructure. The Bank Commissioner of Massachusetts, Joseph Allen, began to circle the Securities Exchange Company like a hawk. He demanded to see the books. He demanded proof of the coupons. Ponzi, ever the master of the bluff, welcomed the scrutiny with a smile. He gave the authorities a tour of his office, showing them the mountains of cash as if the presence of the money itself was proof of its origin. He was playing a high-stakes game of psychological warfare. He knew that if he could keep the public's faith, the regulators would be afraid to touch him. If they shut him down, they would be the villains who destroyed the people's chance at wealth. But the pressure was mounting. Behind the scenes, Ponzi was scrambling to find a way to legitimize the fraud before the music stopped. He began buying up shares in local banks, attempting to gain control of the very institutions that were investigating him. He was trying to buy the law itself. He was a man running at full speed toward a cliff, convinced that if he just ran fast enough, he could learn to fly. The first cracks appeared not in the ledgers, but in the press. A financial writer for the Boston Post began to ask the questions that no one else dared to voice. Where were the coupons? How could a man move millions of dollars in postal vouchers without a single record of a large-scale transaction with the post office? The mystery was no longer about a brilliant discovery. It was about a hidden void. The world was beginning to look closer at the man who sold the miracle, and the closer they looked, the more the golden facade began to peel. The silence in the halls of the Securities Exchange Company was replaced by a low, rhythmic thrum of anxiety. It was the sound of 1,000 hearts beating in sync as the first whispers of doubt began to circulate through the city. Charles Ponzi, the man who had promised to conquer the financial world, was now a man besieged. The Boston Post had hired a financial expert to analyze the numbers, a man who looked past the charisma and the piles of cash to the cold, hard reality of the ledger. The verdict was devastating. To fulfill his obligations, Ponzi would have needed over 160 million international reply coupons in circulation. The total number actually issued by the Postal Service was barely 27,000. The gap was not just a discrepancy. It was an abyss. In a desperate bid to maintain control, Ponzi did something unthinkable. He invited the district attorney and the banking regulators to audit his books. It was the ultimate gamble of a world-class con artist, a performance of such supreme confidence that it briefly paralyzed his enemies. He halted all new investments, claiming he wanted to prove his solvency once and for all. But while he sat in his office, calmly smoking expensive cigars and charming the investigators, he was secretly funneling the remaining cash into a frantic series of diversions. He was paying off the loudest critics, buying the silence of those who could smell the rot. The pressure was not just coming from the law. The crowd outside School Street was changing. The faces that once held adoration were now etched with a desperate, hungry fear. They had heard the rumors. They had read the headlines. They wanted their money back. Ponzi, sensing the shift in the wind, stepped out onto the balcony. He didn't hide. He didn't run. He stood before the masses and promised them that every cent was safe, that the miracle was real. He ordered his clerks to pay out every person who demanded a refund, down to the last penny. He was betting that by showing he could pay, he would stop the panic. It was a masterstroke of psychological manipulation. As people saw their neighbors walking away with bags of cash, the panic subsided. Some even turned around and gave the money right back to him. They chose the lie because the truth was too painful to bear. They wanted to believe in the miracle more than they feared the math. But while the crowds cheered, the investigation was closing in. The district attorney's office had discovered a secret that Ponzi had buried deep in his past. A criminal record under a different name in Montreal. He wasn't just a businessman with a flawed model. He was a convicted forger. The mask was slipping. Behind the scenes, his own publicist, William McMasters, had become a whistleblower. McMasters had realized that his employer was a financial parasite, a man who was hopelessly insolvent. He saw that Ponzi was not investing the money. He was merely reshuffling it. The genius of the system was not in the coupons, but in the human heart's capacity for self-deception. As the sun set on the final days of July 1920, the walls of the Securities Exchange Company began to close in. The auditors were about to look into the one drawer that Ponzi could not hide. The drawer that contained the truth about where the money had gone and why there was nothing left to catch the fall. The clock finally struck 0 on the morning of August 12th, 1920. The auditors had finished their grim tally. Charles Ponzi was not just short on funds. He was over $7 million in debt to his investors. The mathematical miracle had collapsed into a mathematical impossibility. As the news hit the front pages, the streets of Boston transformed into a scene of chaos and despair. The lines that once represented hope now represented ruin. Thousands of people, many of whom had handed over their entire life savings, realized that the money was gone. It hadn't been lost in a bad trade or stolen by a rival. It had never existed. The arrest of Charles Ponzi was not a quiet affair. It was the fall of a king. He surrendered to the authorities with the same theatrical flair he had used to build his empire, maintaining his innocence even as the handcuffs clicked shut. In the months that followed, the full scale of the devastation became clear. 6 banks collapsed in the wake of his downfall. Families were evicted from their homes. The immigrants of the North End, the people Ponzi had claimed to champion, were the hardest hit. They had trusted a man who spoke their language and shared their heritage, only to be bled dry by his ambition. Ponzi was sentenced to prison, first by the federal government and then by the state. But the man who gave his name to the world's most infamous financial crime was never truly defeated in his own mind, even as he was eventually deported back to Italy and later died in a charity ward in Brazil. He remained a salesman to the very end. He had realized a fundamental truth about the human condition. People do not want to hear the truth about risk and patience. They want to believe in the shortcut. They want to believe that someone, somewhere, has found a way to cheat the system. Today, the Ponzi scheme remains the blueprint for the greatest financial crimes in history. From the multi-billion-dollar collapse of Bernard Madoff to the digital age of cryptocurrency frauds, the mechanism remains identical. The names change, the technology evolves, but the underlying architecture of the lie never does. It is a cycle of greed, recruitment, and inevitable gravity. Charles Ponzi didn't just invent a scam. He exposed a permanent flaw in the machinery of civilization. He proved that as long as there is a desire for a miracle, there will be a man willing to sell one. To understand the future of money, we must first understand its past. Subscribe to uncover the truth.